The atmosphere in the grandiose ballroom of the renowned Mortimer House was one of high society's rarefied elegance, a musical soiree. It was to be an evening where the finest minds and the wealthiest hearts mingled, their laughter and conversations echoing in the vast, marble-clad hall. However, as the clock struck 10, a sudden, chilling event shattered this serene opulence. The world-renowned pianist, Raymond Duval, was found dead in his private music room. The news spread like wildfire, seeping into every corner of the house, and striking fear into the hearts of those attending the gathering. What made the situation all the more disturbing was the manner of his death. He had been playing his final piece, a melancholic sonata, when the final notes faltered and were replaced by an unnatural, eerie silence. There, his fingers still pressed against the piano keys, Duval's lifeless body lay slumped over the instrument. His death was immediate, and yet the music seemed to linger in the air, as though it too were a silent witness to the act. The guests, initially stunned, soon became caught in a web of confusion. There was no sign of struggle, no blood spilled across the floor, only the faintest whiff of something more sinister, a smell, fleeting, almost imperceptible, but enough to unsettle the observers. The piano itself stood undisturbed, as though it were the last link to an unknown tragedy. As the authorities scrambled to make sense of this inexplicable crime, one name was repeated with a sense of whispered awe and dread: Hercule Poirot. Across the continent, Poirot had become legendary not just for his remarkable talent in solving even the most baffling cases, but for his unwavering dedication to understanding the intricacies of the human mind. His little grey cells, as he often referred to them, had solved mysteries that others could never hope to unravel. Yet, this crime seemed different. How could anyone have committed such an act in a room where every sound was heard and every gesture was observed as the police struggled to make sense of the scene? One thing was clear: they needed help. And so, an urgent telegram was dispatched. Hercule Poirot was to come. He arrived at Mortimer House by midnight, his immaculate presence making an indelible impression on all those who crossed his path. As he stepped out of the carriage, his finely tailored coat and polished shoes reflected the starlight, and his signature boatie appeared even more polished than usual. There was nothing out of place, not a single wrinkle on his attire, and he moved with a deliberate grace that suggested he was already absorbing the atmosphere round him. The gathering had already begun to disband, with the guests' gossip filling. It wasn't long before the sound of Poirot's name spread through the crowd like a silent whisper. The guests, a mixture of musicians, aristocrats, and intellectuals, gave way to the detective, their faces drawn with anxiety and fear. "Ah, mon ami," Captain Hastings exclaimed, catching sight of Poirot in the hallway. "There you are. It is worse than I thought." Poirot's eyes sparkled behind his neat spectacles. "It is indeed a tragedy, Hastings, but one must remain calm. The truth must be found, and you, my dear friend, shall see it unfold before your very eyes." The two men entered the music room, the scene of the crime. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness. The piano keys, dark and untouched, stood as a mute witness to the death that had occurred. The only sound was the ticking of a wall clock, its second hand moving relentlessly forward. Poirot, surveying the room with a trained eye, observed the arrangement of the room. It seemed orderly. Too orderly. The piano stood against the far wall, the sheet music still in place, the black and white keys gleaming in the dim light. "Tell me, Hastings," Poirot said, his voice soft but precise, "what is the most peculiar aspect of this scene?" Hastings looked around the room, his mind working to comprehend the strange tableau in front of him. The fact that the man was playing the piano, and then he was simply gone, just like that. It's as though he was struck down mid-performance. Poirot nodded, taking a step forward. Yes, Hastings, that is the truth. But it is more than that. It is the reason for his death that holds the key. It is not merely the shock of a life ended. No, there is something hidden here. There is a mystery beneath the surface, as there always is. He paused, his gaze falling on the music sheet lying open on the piano. The last notes of the sonata scrawled delicately across the page. A faint smile tugged at the corners of Poirot's lips. This is the key, Hastings, the music, and the one who played it. Hastings' brows furrowed in confusion. But the music is just music. Poirot, what could it possibly mean? Poirot's gaze narrowed. Ah, mon ami, that is where you are mistaken. Music is far more than just notes and rhythms. It is an expression of the soul, of thoughts, of feelings that are not always so easily understood. Raymond Duval, the pianist, may have been playing for the dead, but there is a reason he played, and a reason why someone would silence him. In such a manner, Hastings remained silent, absorbing Poirot's words. There was a tension in the air that he could not ignore. The case, he now realized, was not as simple as it appeared. Poirot turned to face the captain. "We shall begin, Hastings. The investigation is not just about finding the killer. It is about understanding why they killed. And that, my friend, is where our work truly begins. Thus, the investigation into the curious case of the pianist who played for the dead had begun. Poirot's mind, as ever, was already a step ahead. As he prepared to dive into the psychological intricacies of those involved, for he knew, as always, that the answers lay not in what could be seen, but in what could be understood. The next morning, the drawing room of Mortimer House was filled with the hushed murmurings of the remaining guests. A mixed crowd of musicians, aristocrats, and scholars, all too aware of the terrible event that had unfolded the night before. As Poirot entered the room, his sharp gaze took in the scene, his mind already working at full capacity, piecing together the clues no one else had noticed. He was a master of observation, but it was the psychology of the human mind that truly fascinated him. He knew that the truth of Raymond Duval's death would lie in the motivations and contradictions of those present in the room, and he would not rest until he had unraveled every thread. Poirot did not waste time with pleasantries. He simply addressed the room, his voice calm but commanding. "I must ask that you all remain here while I conduct my investigation. We have much to discuss. There is a murder to be solved, and every one of you, I am afraid, holds a piece of the puzzle. The suspects, sitting in their various states of unease, exchanged glances. The air was thick with suspicion, though no one dared to speak outright. One by one, Poirot's gaze swept across them, noting their body language, the slight tremors in their hands, the nervous fidgeting of their eyes. All told him something, but it was the way they reacted to each other, the subtle shifts in their attitudes and words that would reveal their secrets. The first to speak was Lady Gertrude Mortimer, the matron of the house, a woman whose elegant beauty had long since faded into a kind of hard-edged reserve. She had been at the piano performance the night before and had seen the tragic death firsthand. She sat stiffly in her chair, her fingers lightly tapping a silver-tipped fan against her knee. "I never trusted Duval," she said, her voice laced with disdain. He was too self-absorbed, always playing for an audience as though the world owed him something. "But I never imagined someone would harm him." Poirot studied her carefully. She was a woman of high society, accustomed to having her opinions respected. But there was something else in her words, a touch of bitterness, perhaps a reason to dislike Duval. Poirot's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than was customary, but he did not comment. Not yet. Next was the pianist's wife, Madeleine Duval, who sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She was a striking woman, though her beauty was subdued, almost somber. Her eyes were puffy, as though she had been crying, though no tear stains marked her perfectly made-up face. "My husband was a genius," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "But he was always so distant. I don't know why anyone would want to hurt him." Poirot's eyes softened slightly, though his mind remained sharp. There was sorrow in her voice, but also something else, something guarded. She said she didn't know, but Poirot doubted it. He could feel the tension beneath her words. Like a carefully constructed wall. Dr. Sebastian Fowler, a well-known doctor and a close friend of the Mortimers, was the third to speak. He was a tall man, with a thin face and sharp features that gave him an almost predatory look. Raymond was an odd man, he said, his tone clinical. He never seemed to truly care for anyone but himself. It's difficult to say, but I can't say I'm shocked. There were rumors about debts, about women. A man with so many vices can't expect a peaceful end. Poirot's eyebrows raised. Rumors, you say? Do these rumors perhaps have a name? He asked, his voice deliberately soft, almost conversational. Dr. Fowler paused, his eyes shifting uncomfortably. I only heard things. It's not for me to repeat. He stammered, suddenly defensive. Poirot smiled inwardly, but said nothing. Dr. Fowler's discomfort was telling. It was often the quiet ones, the ones who appeared most composed, who held the darkest secrets. Poirot made a mental note to revisit the good doctor later. Then there was Percival Mason, the wealthy patron of the arts, who had funded much of Duval's career. His presence in the room was commanding, but there was an underlying insecurity in the way he clutched his cane. Duval was a talent, yes, but he was a burden, Mason said, his voice heavy with bitterness. He was always late with his commitments, always demanding more money, more time. It was exhausting. I regret helping him. It was a mistake. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp. A burden, you say? But surely, Mr. Mason, a man of your stature would never hold a grudge against such an artist. Would you, Mason's face flushed a shade darker, but he quickly masked his reaction with a forced smile. No, it's not that. It's just he was difficult to work with. That's all. Poirot's mind ticked. Mason was far too eager to explain himself. His words rang hollow, and Poirot suspected there was more to this story than he was letting on. But the most curious of the lot, Poirot knew, was yet to speak. The final suspect was the one who had been closest to Duval, the one whose presence in the music room should have been inconspicuous. A young woman, Leila Bennett, a fellow musician who had once studied under Duval's tutelage. She sat at the far end of the room, silent and withdrawn, her hands clenched in her lap. Her face was pale, and she seemed almost lost in thought. The tension around her was palpable. Poirot stood, slowly making his way towards her. Mademoiselle Bennet, he said softly, his eyes never leaving hers. You are very quiet. Too quiet, perhaps. Do you have something to share with us? Leila looked up, her eyes briefly meeting Poirot's, but she quickly looked away, her lips trembling. I don't know anything, she whispered, though Poirot could hear the faint catch in her breath. And yet, Poirot continued, you were very close to Raymond Duval, were you not? A close relationship, perhaps, a relationship that may have been more than professional. Leila shifted uncomfortably, her hands tightening in her lap. The silence in the room grew thicker. Poirot turned to the rest of the suspects, his eyes narrowing. You see, my friends, every one of you holds a piece of the puzzle, and each one of you, I suspect, is hiding something. The game had begun. The pieces were moving, and soon the truth would be revealed. The morning passed quietly, with Poirot having discreetly observed his suspects, listening to their conversations and noting their behavior. The guests, for the most part, seemed anxious and on edge, eager for some resolution, yet reluctant to speak openly, despite the apparent calm. Poirot could sense the undercurrent of fear that ran through the room. He knew that the truth was not far off, but it was still cloaked in shadows, and his task was to draw it into the light dot by early afternoon. Poirot had called in the local police detective, Inspector Barnaby, to discuss the details of the investigation. Barnaby was a stout, middle-aged man, a veteran of many cases, but his sharp eyes betrayed his nervousness at having the great Hercule Poirot looking over his shoulder. Poirot's reputation preceded him, and Barnaby was all too aware that Poirot's methods would leave no stone unturned. There's no sign of forced entry, sir, Barnaby reported, his voice gruff. No sign of struggle, no weapons, no nothing, just the piano, and the body slumped over it, as if Duval had been struck down mid-performance. Poirot, who had been quietly sipping his tea, placed the cup down with delicate precision. His eyes, sharp as ever, scanned the room for any trace of disturbance. Mon ami, that is what troubles me. A man of such genius, a pianist so renowned, dies in his prime without any apparent cause. It is too simple, far too simple for my taste. Barnaby shifted uncomfortably, his brow furrowing. What do you mean, Poirot? Poirot paused, his mind working through the tangled threads. I believe we are overlooking something, he said slowly, his voice taking on the hint of a challenge. Tell me, Inspector, did anyone hear the sound of footsteps before the moment Duval died? Barnaby frowned, considering. I don't believe anyone did, sir. Duval's music was loud, but nothing else. No one saw or heard anything unusual. Poirot's expression was unreadable. He leaned forward, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the table. You see, that is the flaw in your theory. If Duval had been struck down while playing, as you suggest, someone must have been in the room to do so. But no one heard any footsteps. No one noticed anything strange, except for the moment when Duval suddenly ceased to play. Barnaby opened his mouth to speak, but Poirot raised a finger to silence him. Do not misunderstand me, Inspector. There was no direct violence. The death was not caused by a physical blow. But what if it was caused by something more subtle? The detective paused, looking around the room. His eyes flicked to the piano keys, then to the chair where Duval's wife, Madeleine, had been sitting earlier that morning. I believe that the answer is hidden in the music. There was something more than a simple death here. There was a game played, a psychological game, and Duval was its first victim. Poirot's statement hung in the air like a heavy fog, and for a moment, no one spoke. Barnaby's face was a mask of confusion, but Poirot had already turned his attention to another detail. As he looked around the room, his gaze fell on a small, inconspicuous piece of paper lying on a table near the door. It had not been noticed by anyone else, but Poirot's sharp eye caught the slight crease in the corner, as if it had been hastily discarded. With a swift movement, Poirot reached for the paper and unfolded it. His eyes scanned the contents quickly, and his lips parted in surprise. What is it, Poirot? Barnaby asked, stepping closer. Poirot looked up, his face thoughtful. A letter, a note of some kind, addressed to Duval. It appears to be from a woman named Eloise. She writes about a meeting, a confrontation. It seems that Duval had been involved in a delicate affair, perhaps a lover's quarrel. The room fell silent. Poirot did not give away too much at this moment. He carefully folded the paper and placed it into his pocket. This, my friends, is what we call a lead. It is a false lead. The room seemed to tighten, the air thick with the implications of his words. The name Eloise meant nothing to them at that point, but Poirot knew that this was the very thing that would send them all on the wrong path. I am confident that this is a trap, Poirot continued, his voice unwavering. The note has been placed deliberately to mislead us, to turn us toward one suspect. But we must resist. It is not the woman who killed Duval. It is someone who wanted to hide the truth. Someone who knew how to manipulate us. Poirot rose from his seat, his eyes piercing as he surveyed the room of suspects. He had planted the seed of doubt, and now it was time to watch how it would grow. Later that day, Poirot called a meeting with the suspects, gathering them once again in the drawing room. He knew that the note had already begun to shift the dynamics. creating a sense of fear and paranoia. The guests were now more on edge than ever before. Their nerves taut as Poirot took his place at the head of the room. He had already made his move, and now it was time to allow the others to make theirs. Madeleine Duval was the first to speak. Her voice was trembling, her face pale. I don't understand, she said softly. What does the note mean? Who is Eloise? I swear, I didn't know about any woman in his life other than myself. Poirot turned his gaze on her, his expression unreadable. Mademoiselle Duval, I believe you, but your emotions are clouding your judgment. It is not about Eloise. It is about control, power, and manipulation. Dr. Fowler, who had been quiet until now, spoke up with a nervous edge to his voice. What do you mean, Poirot? Are you saying someone has orchestrated this whole thing? Poirot's eyes gleamed with intelligence. Indeed. Mon ami, someone is trying to play us like Duval played his piano, and I believe I know who. He paused for effect, his gaze sweeping over the room. But before we jump to conclusions, we must examine each of you, each of your motivations, and your alibis. There is no rush. The truth will emerge. The room was silent, the tension palpable. Poirot had set his trap, and now it was only a matter of time before one of them would slip up. He knew the truth was not far off, and soon he would expose the mastermind behind the murder. The pieces were falling into place, but the game, it seemed, was only just beginning. Poirot's investigation had entered a delicate phase. He had disarmed the first false lead with his usual precision, leaving the suspects unnerved, unsure of where the trail would lead next. The atmosphere in Mortimer House had changed. The careful tension that marked the previous evening had deepened into something more brittle, suspicion. It was no longer just the police who watched the guests. Poirot had placed them all under scrutiny, and each was aware that their every word, every gesture, might betray them. Poirot knew he had only a limited amount of time before the truth was forced into the open. There were psychological games to play, questions to be asked, and, most crucially, reactions to observe. He was an expert in reading people, understanding the gaps between what they said and what they actually meant. And with that knowledge, he would unveil the hidden motives, the unspoken truths. The room was gathered once again. Poirot had called for the suspects to assemble in the drawing room. He stood at the front, as always, with his hands clasped neatly in front of him, his gaze scanning the room like a hawk eyeing its prey. His sharp eyes flicked over each face, studying every twitch, every involuntary movement. Mon ami, Poirot began, his voice calm and deliberate. We have arrived at an important moment in our investigation. You have all given your statements, and yet there is more to this mystery than what has been revealed so far. The guests exchanged nervous glances, and Poirot smiled inwardly. They were unsettled, just as he had hoped. It is now time for us to play a game, he continued, his voice carrying an unmistakable authority. A game of truth. I shall ask each of you a single question, and I expect nothing but the truth in your answer. No more evasion, no more half-truths. He turned first to Lady Gertrude Mortimer, who was sitting rigidly in her chair, her hands still fidgeting with her fan. "Lady Mortimer," Poirot began, his voice polite but unyielding. "You spoke earlier of Duval's character. You said you never trusted him. Can you tell me, then, what exactly you meant by that? Was it merely his talent that you resented, or was there something more?" Lady Mortimer stiffened, her eyes narrowing. "I didn't." She cut herself off and took a deep breath before speaking again. Raymond Duval was insufferable. He thought the world owed him something. But that's not all. There were whispers about money, affairs. He was always chasing after something more money, more attention, more status. He made people uncomfortable. That's all. Poirot watched her closely, his eyes narrowing. "And did you, Lady Mortimer, perhaps feel that your own status was threatened by Duval's presence in your home? Was there a rivalry, perhaps, over what he represented?" The question landed like a dart, and Poirot could see her struggle for a moment before she straightened her posture. "Not at all," she said, her voice defensive. "I had nothing to fear from him. He was just a nuisance, that's all." Poirot smiled thinly. "A nuisance, yes, but perhaps a nuisance that had more significance than you are willing to admit." He turned away from her, his gaze moving on dot necks. Poirot's attention shifted to Madeleine Duval, the widow. Her face was pale, and her eyes were rimmed with faint red, evidence of the sorrow she had tried to mask. "Mademoiselle Duval," Poirot said, his voice gentler now, "you spoke of your husband with much affection. Yet something in your words felt restrained. Tell me, was there something more to your marriage that we are not seeing? Something more complicated?" Madeleine's gaze flickered toward the floor. She took a shaky breath, her hands clasped tightly together. "Raymond was complicated," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He wasn't the man everyone thought he was. He was brilliant, yes, but he was distant. We didn't have the life everyone thought we did. He had his secrets. He wasn't always faithful." She stopped, her voice faltering. Poirot's sharp gaze softened slightly, but only for a moment. He leaned forward slightly, his voice cutting through the air. "And did you know about these secrets, Mademoiselle Duval? Were you aware of his other relationships? Perhaps one of them became dangerous?" Madeleine's face twisted with discomfort, but she quickly masked it, her eyes hardening. "I didn't know all the details, but yes, I knew. It wasn't a secret, and no, I don't think any of his affairs had anything to do with his death." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, but did not press her further. The truth was, he could sense there was much more lurking beneath her words, but now was not the time to press for it. He turned to Dr. Sebastian Fowler. "Dr. Fowler," Poirot began, "you have known Duval for many years. You've said yourself that he was a man of vices and debts. What exactly did you mean by that? Were you involved in any of his financial troubles?" Fowler straightened in his chair, his expression defensive. "I'm a doctor, not a financier. But yes, Duval had issues. I didn't get involved, but there were rumors. He owed money to several people, and I suspect he was trying to hide it. He had a reputation for being extravagant, for living beyond his means. It's hardly surprising that someone might have wanted to silence him. Poirot's eyes hardened. And you, Dr. Fowler, had no reason to benefit from his death? No reason at all to want him out of the picture? Fowler's lips tightened. No, Poirot, no. I have no reason to harm him. Poirot's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before he nodded slowly. Very well. But remember, Doctor, all of us have motives, whether we recognize them or not. Poirot turned to Percival Mason, the wealthy patron. Mason's expression was carefully controlled, but his posture betrayed a hint of anxiety. Mr. Mason, Poirot began, you spoke earlier about Duval being a burden. You mentioned his debts and behavior. But what about your own role in all this? You helped him, funded his career. What were your true feelings about him? Mason shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping nervously against his cane. I was simply trying to help him. He was a talent, after all, but he was always demanding more, always wanting something. It became exhausting, and when he started getting involved with these women, I could see that it was only a matter of time before things fell apart. He wasn't just a pianist. He was a liability. Poirot's gaze didn't waver. And you, Mr. Mason, were you perhaps trying to distance yourself from that liability? Did you feel threatened by Duval's lifestyle? Did he push you too far? Mason's face flushed, but he quickly regained his composure. I've already said, Poirot, that I had no more to do with him than what was necessary. I wanted him to succeed, but he was impossible to work with. That's all. Poirot nodded, but his mind was already several steps ahead. He had planted his questions, and now he watched carefully for any sign of a crack in their carefully constructed facades. Lastly, Poirot turned to Leela Bennet, who had remained silent for most of the questioning. Her eyes, though seemingly distant, were watching him closely. Mademoiselle Bennet, Poirot said, his voice soft, but piercing. You were close to Duval. More than close, I suspect. What was your relationship with him? And did you, perhaps, have something to gain from his death? Leela's eyes flickered with emotion before she quickly masked it, her lips trembling. I was a student of Duval's, she began, her voice cracking. He taught me how to play, how to perform. But it wasn't like that. I didn't want him dead. Poirot tilted his head slightly, studying her reaction. You did not wish him dead, Mademoiselle Bennet, but surely you must have known that there were many who did not approve of his behavior. Did he ever make promises to you? Was there something unsaid between you? Leela's expression faltered, but she quickly looked away, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. No, Poirot, I didn't kill him. I couldn't. I didn't even know who he really was until it was too late. Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, but you knew him well enough, did you not? The room fell silent again. The game had begun in earnest, and Poirot was playing it with the skill and precision of a master. The afternoon waned into evening, but the tension within the walls of Mortimer House had not dissipated. In fact, it had thickened. The suspects, having been questioned one by one, sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. weighed down by the unsettling nature of their answers. Poirot had kept his observations to himself, but his mind was already piecing together the puzzle with the precision of a skilled craftsman. Each clue, each reaction, each inconsistency had brought him a step closer to the truth. But there was still one more piece to place. The atmosphere in the drawing room was suffocating, as the guests nervously fidgeted, unwilling to speak. Unless spoken to, Poirot knew that the subtle psychological game he had played was beginning to bear fruit. His questions had exposed cracks in their facades. But what they didn't know was that Poirot had been observing more than just their words. He had been listening for something deeper, the hidden emotions, the suppressed fears, the unresolved desires that each one of them carried. These were the true clues. Poirot stood up from his chair and paced the room slowly, his hands behind, his back. His keen eyes never left the guests as he took each step, seemingly lost in thought. The silence stretched on for a moment longer before he broke it, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Mon Amos," Poirot began, his tone calm but commanding. "We have discussed many things, but I believe we have yet to get to the heart of this matter. You see, the truth is not always found in the obvious. It is found in the shadows, in the places where people are most afraid to look." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. The room was still, every suspect hanging on his every word. Poirot continued, his eyes scanning each face in turn. "I have been listening carefully, not just to what you have said, but to how you have said it. The smallest slip of the tongue, the slightest change in your voice, can reveal far more than you realize. And now, it is time for one of you to reveal what has been hidden all along." The guests shifted uneasily, but Poirot's gaze was fixed on Leela Bennet. She was seated in the far corner of the room, her body stiff with tension, her hands trembling in her lap. She had been quiet since the questioning, barely speaking at all. But Poirot had observed something in her, something that suggested the key to the mystery lay with her. Poirot's eyes softened as he approached her. "Mademoiselle Bennet," he said gently, his voice a little less forceful than before. "You have been very quiet, too quiet, perhaps, but I understand, sometimes. It is the quiet ones who have the most to hide." Leela looked up at him, her face pale, her eyes wide with something resembling fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Poirot waited, his patience unwavering. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. I never wanted it to go this far," she murmured, her hands shaking. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt. But it was all getting out of control. I had no choice." The room fell into an immediate hush. The other suspects looked at each other, their faces a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Leela's confession was unexpected. But what exactly was she confessing to? Poirot took a step closer to her, his face full of concern. "Mademoiselle Bennet, what do you mean? What is it that you had no choice about?" Leela hesitated, her fingers twisting nervously. It was Duval. He was going to ruin everything. I couldn't let him destroy my career, my future. She looked up at Poirot, her eyes filled with anguish. "I tried to warn him. I tried to get him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. And when I realized he wouldn't, when I realized he was going to expose everything, I had no choice but to stop him. Poirot's expression softened as he approached her. You mean you killed him? Lila's breath caught in her throat. No, it wasn't like that. I didn't kill him. Not directly. It wasn't. I didn't plan it. I swear I didn't. But I did something. Something that made it happen. I gave him something that would cause him to collapse. Something that would make him stop playing. Poirot's mind raced as he processed her words. A subtle poison, perhaps. Something that would act quickly, yet silently, making it appear as though Duval had died unexpectedly. He had suspected something of the sort, but to hear it confirmed was a breakthrough. Poison, then? Poirot asked, his voice steady but full of determination. Lila nodded slowly, her face pale. I didn't mean to kill him. It was supposed to be just a little, just enough to make him weak, to stop him from playing. That night. But I didn't know what would happen. I didn't know it would kill him. Her voice cracked with guilt. I thought I could just scare him, make him realize what he was doing to me, to my future. But I was wrong. I killed him, Poirot. I killed him. The room was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. The confession had come as a shock to everyone, but Poirot's expression was calm, collected. He had known there was more to the story than met the eye, and now the puzzle pieces were starting to fall into place. Poirot turned to the others, his eyes hardening. Do you see now, Ms. Amos? It was not a simple murder. It was a crime born of desperation, of fear. Lila Bennett did not kill Duval with malice. She killed him with her own fear. Fear of losing everything she had worked for. Fear of being exposed for what she had done in secret. She saw no way out, and so she took the only path she thought she could. The room was still. The reality of what had just been revealed settling over the guests like a heavy fog. Poirot glanced once more at Lila, who had collapsed into her chair, her face streaked with tears. You see, my friends, Poirot continued, his voice taking on a quiet finality. The truth is never as simple as it seems. It is often hidden beneath layers of fear, pride, and desperation. But now we know. We know what happened that night, and we know who is responsible. Lila, her hands trembling, looked up at Poirot. What will happen to me? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Poirot's gaze softened, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. You will face the consequences of your actions, Mademoiselle Bennett. But you will also face the truth of your own guilt. The truth, as always, will be your judge. The room was still for a long moment, as if the very air had been stolen away by the weight of the confession. But Poirot had done his job. He had unraveled the mystery, and in the process, he had revealed the deep psychological turmoil that had led to the death of Raymond Duval. The confession had shattered the fragile calm that had reigned in Mortimer House. But it was not the end of the mystery. Rather, it was a turning point. Lila Bennett, now overwhelmed by guilt and terror, had revealed the terrible truth behind the death of Raymond Duval. But Poirot, Ever the perfectionist, knew that this was not yet the final act. There were still pieces to fit into the puzzle, threads to tie up, and truths to be fully revealed. The room had fallen into an uncomfortable silence after Lilla's confession. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from tears. She seemed almost hollow, as though she could no longer hold the weight of her own actions. The other guests sat frozen, some in shock, others in disbelief, their gazes flickering from Poirot to Lila and back again. Poirot's gaze softened as he watched her. He understood better than anyone the powerful emotions that could drive a person to commit such an act. But understanding did not absolve the crime, and Poirot knew that justice must still be served. Lila, Poirot began, his voice calm yet firm. Your confession has brought us to the truth, but it is not the end of your journey. You must now face the consequences of your actions. Lila looked up, her eyes desperate. I never meant to kill him, she whispered, her voice shaky. I just wanted him to stop, to understand what he was doing to me. I never thought it would end like this. Poirot nodded slowly, his face a mask of sympathy. I believe you. Mademoiselle Bennet, you did not intend to kill him, but your actions led to his death. And now, you must live with the consequences. The law will take its course. Lila lowered her head, her hands shaking as she clasped them together in her lap. I never meant for any of this to happen, she repeated, almost to herself. I just wanted him to stop playing. I never wanted him to die. Poirot stepped away from her, turning his attention to the other guests, who were still processing the shocking revelation. The sense of dread that had hung over Mortimer House now seemed heavier than ever. There was an unspoken tension in the room, as though the guests were all waiting for the next move, the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. Poirot's eyes swept over them, and his voice broke the silence. Now, mon Amis, we must address the consequences of Lila's actions. We must ensure that justice is served, and that the truth is known. But there is something else, something deeper, that we must examine. For you see, Mademoiselle Bennet's actions were not born in isolation. There were others involved, whether directly or indirectly. Madeleine Duval, who had been sitting in stunned silence, suddenly spoke up, her voice trembling. What do you mean, Poirot? She asked. You said it yourself. Lila acted out of fear. What more could there be? Poirot's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he responded. Fear, yes, but also guilt and ambition. Mademoiselle Bennet may have acted out of fear for her future, but there were others in this house whose actions helped create the environment that led to Duval's death. You, Mademoiselle Duval, your husband's debts, his affairs, the pressure you placed on him. They all contributed to the man he became. Madeleine flinched at Poirot's words, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. You don't understand, she said, her voice breaking. Raymond's affairs, his debts, they were part of who he was. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. He was destroying us both. He didn't care. He never did. Poirot nodded slowly. I know, and yet, that does not excuse what happened. Your husband's actions were not the sole cause of his death. but they played a part in the unraveling of his life. And, Mademoiselle Duval, your response to his betrayal, your silence, your resignation, only served to deepen the tragedy. You were complicit in the sense that you allowed him to continue on his destructive path. Madeleine's face twisted. With anguish, I didn't know what to do, she said, her voice barely audible. I loved him, even when he betrayed me. I thought I could fix him, but I couldn't. And now, he's dead. And Poirot did not interrupt her. He simply watched, his eyes steady, as she grappled with her emotions. The tension in the room was palpable. Madeleine's guilt was written across her face. But there was something else there as well, something darker. Poirot shifted his attention to the others, his mind still working, analyzing each of their reactions. He had a feeling that more was at play here than what had been revealed so far. The sense of unease had not just come from Lilla's actions. It had come from the atmosphere of Mortimer House itself, the undercurrent of secrets and unspoken truths. And what of you, Dr. Fowler? Poirot's voice sliced through the room, turning the spotlight onto the doctor, whose face had grown pale at the mention of his name. You have been the quiet observer throughout this investigation, but I believe you know more than you have let on. You are not as innocent as you would have us believe. Dr. Fowler stiffened, his hands clenching at his sides. What do you mean? He asked, his voice defensive. Poirot took a step closer to him. You have been involved in Duval's life in ways you have not admitted. You were not just a casual friend. You knew about his debts, his affairs. You knew about his weaknesses, his fears, and yet you did nothing to intervene. You stood by while he spiraled out of control. Why? Dr. Fowler's face contorted with frustration, but he said nothing for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. Finally, he spoke. I did what I could, he said, his voice strained. I was his doctor, not his confessor. I tried to help him, but he was beyond saving. I couldn't control him. I couldn't stop him from destroying himself. Poirot's gaze hardened. Perhaps you couldn't stop him, but you could have done more. You could have intervened when it mattered, but you chose to stand by, to watch him self-destruct. And in doing so, you allowed his death to unfold. The room fell silent again. Poirot's words had cut through the atmosphere like a knife, exposing the truths that had been lurking beneath the surface. And as for you, Mr. Mason, Poirot continued, his voice quiet but firm. You were the one who enabled Duval's reckless behavior. You funded his career, provided him with the means to live beyond his means. You could have stopped him before things went too far, but you allowed him to continue on his destructive path. Mason's face darkened, his hands gripping his cane tightly. I did what I thought was right, he said, his voice low. I believed in Duval's talent, but I didn't know how far he'd fall. I never expected him to. Poirot's eyes narrowed. You never expected him to spiral so far, did you, Mr. Mason? But now, you are all complicit in what happened. Each of you played a role in creating the circumstances that led to Duval's death. The guests sat in stunned silence, their guilt hanging heavily in the air. Poirot had exposed their involvement, forcing them to confront the consequences of their actions. The investigation had not just revealed the identity of the murderer. It had laid bare the darker side of Mortimer House, a place built on secrets, lies, and unresolved tensions. Poirot's gaze swept over the room one last time. "The truth has been revealed," he said softly, his voice heavy with finality. "But now, it is time for each of you to face the consequences of your actions." The investigation was far from over, but Poirot had accomplished what he had set out to do. The pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, and now it was only a matter of time before the final resolution came, and justice was served. The evening wore on, and as the guests of Mortimer House sat in the drawing room, an uncomfortable silence settled over them. The weight of Poirot's words from earlier had pressed upon them all, but none more so than the guilty party. Leila Bennet's confession, though momentarily a catharsis for her, had not removed the burden from the others. No one could deny that they too had played a part in the tragedy, whether through omission, neglect, or silence. The truth was now out, but the consequences of their actions were still to be felt. Poirot stood at the far end of the room, a picture of composure. His mind had been racing since Lila's confession, carefully piecing together the final parts of the puzzle. He knew the case was far more complicated than any one person's involvement. The players in this story were more than just bystanders, more than just incidental figures. They were all intricately tied to the tragic death of Raymond Duval, bound together by secrets, lies, and a shared responsibility for the destruction of a man. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the guests before him. Each one had been part of the performance that had ultimately led to Duval's downfall. But it was not until now, with all the pieces of the puzzle on the table, that Poirot could see the full scope of what had happened. He could now connect the dots, and it was time for the final confrontation. The room had grown colder as the night stretched on. The faces of the suspects were a mixture of guilt, unease, and fear. They knew they were nearing the end of their reckoning, but none of them were prepared for the weight of Poirot's final deductions. There was no escaping the truth now. No matter how much they wished to bury it, their lies and omissions had already been exposed, and Poirot, with his usual precision, was prepared to deliver his final verdict. As Poirot turned to face them, he spoke with his characteristic calmness, but there was a new authority in his voice. "Mon Amos, we have reached the climax of this investigation. We have explored the motives, the lies, the guilt, and the fear that have driven each of you to act in ways you cannot undo. But now, it is time for the truth to be revealed in full." His eyes swept the room, lingering on each suspect in turn. He paused for a moment, allowing the tension to mount. Before continuing, the death of Raymond Duval was not the work of a single hand. It was the culmination of many forces, working together and pushing him toward the brink. Each of you, in your own way, played a role in his demise. But the question remains, who truly killed him? There was a subtle shift in the air as Poirot posed the question, but none of the suspects dared to answer. They were all too fearful, too aware that the final moments of this tragic story had already been written. Poirot took a step forward, his gaze sharp, The answer lies not in who struck the final blow, but in who allowed it to happen. The man who died that night was not just a victim of poison, not just a victim of a single moment of rage. He was the victim of a series of events that had led him to that moment. And to understand who is truly responsible, we must look at each of you, not just as suspects, but as players in this grand tragedy. He began to pace slowly, each step deliberate, each movement measured. Let us first consider Mademoiselle Lila Bennet, who has already confessed to poisoning Duval. She admits to administering a dose that caused him to collapse in the middle of his performance. But she did not intend to kill him. Her plan was to incapacitate him, to stop him from playing that night, to prevent him from exposing her secrets. But in her fear and desperation, she went too far. She thought she could control the situation. But in the end, the poison did what she could. Lila Bennet is not the murderer, but she is certainly responsible for what happened. The room was still as Poirot's words sank in. Lila's face was a mixture of relief and guilt, but there was no denying the truth of Poirot's statement. She had not meant to kill Duval, but her actions had led directly to his death. It was the first step in unraveling the mystery. But Poirot knew the truth went deeper. Poirot turned to Madeleine Duval next, her face pale and strained from the emotional toll of the investigation. Mademoiselle Duval, Poirot began, his tone softer now. You two played a part in this tragedy. You were married to Raymond Duval, and you were aware of his affairs, his debts, and his downward spiral. But you did nothing to intervene. Your silence, your acceptance of his behavior, allowed him to continue down a path of self-destruct. You did not kill him, but you allowed the circumstances that led to his death to unfold without question. Madeleine's eyes filled with tears as she lowered her head. She had not been the murderer, but her passive complicity had allowed Duval's reckless lifestyle to continue unchecked. Poirot's words had struck a deep chord with her, and she seemed to shrink under the weight of her guilt. Poirot's gaze shifted to Dr. Fowler, who was sitting stiffly in his chair, his face a mask of frustration. Dr. Fowler, Poirot said, his voice cutting through the silence. You were not just a bystander. You were a close confidant of Duval, and you knew the depths of his troubles. You were aware of his debt, his self-destructive behavior, and his inability to change. Yet you chose to remain silent. You chose to stand by and do nothing, to let him spiral further into his own madness. Your failure to act, your inability to confront Duval, contributed to his downfall. Fowler's face reddened, and he opened his mouth to speak, but Poirot silenced him with a raised hand. You knew he was in trouble, Dr. Fowler. You knew he needed help, but you did nothing. Your inaction, your indifference, were just as damaging as the actions of those who directly harmed him. Poirot then turned his gaze to Percival Mason, the wealthy patron of the arts. And you, Mr. Mason, were the one who enabled Duval's behavior. You funded his career, supported his extravagant lifestyle, and allowed him to live beyond his means. You two were complicit in this tragedy. You could have cut ties with Duval, but you chose not to. You allowed him to continue his destructive path because you believed in his talent. But talent Mon ami does not excuse the damage done by a man who refuses to take responsibility for his own actions. Mason's face hardened at Poirot's words, but he said nothing. He had been Duval's benefactor, yes, but his refusal to confront the truth of Duval's behavior had allowed the pianist to continue spiraling downward. Poirot paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the room one last time. And now we arrive at the final piece of the puzzle. The person who killed Raymond Duval was not just an innocent bystander. The true murderer was not one person, but a combination of all of you. Each of you contributed to his downfall, whether by action or by inaction. But the final blow was struck when Duval was left alone, vulnerable, and desperate. It was then that the poison was administered, and it was then that the final act played. Out, Poirot paused, letting the room absorb his words. It is a sad truth, but it is the truth, and it is one that none of you can escape. The room remained silent as the gravity of Poirot's deductions settled over the guests. They had all played a part in Duval's death, whether through their actions or their failure to act. But the truth was now clear. The murder of Raymond Duval had not been a singular act of violence. It had been a tragedy built upon years of secrets, lies, and missed opportunities. Poirot stepped back, his gaze softening as he looked at the suspects. Justice will be done, Ms. Amis, but the real justice lies in understanding the consequences of your actions. You will all live with the truth of what happened that night, and that is punishment enough. As Poirot turned to leave the room, his words echoed in the stillness. The mystery had been solved, and the truth had been revealed. But the consequences would linger long after the case was closed. The morning after Poirot's final gathering, the house had an air of stillness about it, a calm before the storm. The resolution of the case was near, but Poirot knew that justice was not only about revealing the truth. It was about making sure that truth was understood in its entirety. Each of the guests, having been confronted with their roles in Duval's demise, were left to wrestle with the weight of their actions. Some were still processing, others in disbelief, and a few, like Leela Bennett, had already begun the process of facing the consequences of their involvement. But Poirot, though outwardly composed, had not finished his work. He had already pieced together most of the puzzle, but there was still something that felt incomplete. One more detail was lingering at the back of his mind. One more key element that had yet to fall into place. It had been right in front of him all along, a clue hidden in plain sight, and now he would bring it to light. Poirot had spent much of the morning going over his notes, his mind running through every moment of the investigation, each conversation, each observation. There was a pattern to the events, but there was also something more subtle. Something that didn't quite match the rest. Something he was certain had been overlooked. The clue he sought was not in the actions of the guests themselves, but in the manner in which they had all behaved after Duval's death. No one had seemed truly surprised by the tragedy. Yes, there had been shock in the initial moments, but after that, something else had taken hold, a sense of resignation, a sense of inevitability that, to Poirot's mind, was both strange and telling. The guests had not reacted to the death of Raymond Duval in the way one would expect. No one had seemed truly outraged or disturbed by the fact that a man had died in such a tragic and violent way. Instead, the death seemed to fall into the category of something that was almost expected. And that was the clue Poirot had missed. Until now, he rose from his chair, his mind racing, and strode to the window overlooking the sprawling grounds of Mortimer House. The fog from the morning had begun to lift, and in the distance, he could see the lush green gardens stretching out before him. Poirot's sharp eyes narrowed as he surveyed the view. He wasn't looking at the scenery, though. He was thinking, piecing together the fragments of information he had gathered. The key was the way the others had interacted with Leela Bennett. There had been something detached in their reactions to her confession. None of them had expressed real shock or remorse. It was as if they already knew something about Duval's death, something they hadn't shared with Poirot. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he finally realized the truth. There had been something missing in their stories all along. A piece of information that didn't fit with the rest. It wasn't the cause of death itself that was important. It was the timing. The guests had reacted to Duval's death as if they had expected it, as if they had known something that Poirot had yet to uncover. He turned back toward the room, and his gaze fell on the small table where the letter from Eloise had been placed. The one that had started the false lead. That letter, with its carefully written words, had led them all down a path of misdirection. But the clue wasn't in the letter itself. It was in the way it had been used. Poirot walked briskly over to the table and picked up the letter, unfolding it with a deliberate slowness. His fingers ran over the paper, feeling its texture, considering its contents once again. It had been a carefully constructed piece of deception. The letter had been planted to lead Poirot and the other guests astray, to distract them from the true nature of the crime. But now, as Poirot reread the letter, he saw something that had eluded him before. The letter was signed by Eloise, but the timing of the note was key. It had been written in haste, and the mention of a confrontation seemed more like an afterthought. It was a cover-up not just for Leela Bennett, but for someone else in the house who had more to hide. Poirot's eyes shifted to the piano, where Raymond Duval had been found lifeless the night of the performance. A sudden realization struck him, and with it, a shiver of understanding. The piano itself was a critical part of this story, not just because it was the instrument Duval had been playing when he collapsed, but because it held a clue that no one had thought to examine closely. Something had been hidden in plain sight, something that had been there all along. Poirot crossed the room to the piano and carefully examined the keys. At first glance, it appeared normal, with no signs of disturbance. But as Poirot's fingers gently traced the edge of the piano, something caught his attention. The faintest indentation in the wood, just beneath the lip of the piano bench. It was subtle, easily missed, but Poirot had an eye for detail. He carefully knelt down and ran his fingers along the edge, feeling the small groove where the wood had been pressed in slightly. It was just enough to catch the light, revealing a faint impression of something that had once been placed there. Something small, but deliberate. Poirot's breath quickened as he realized what it was. He turned to the others, his voice calm but full of authority. "I have found it," he said, his eyes gleaming with a quiet satisfaction. The final piece of the puzzle. The guests, who had been sitting silently, now turned to him, their expressions a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Poirot motioned for them to approach, and they slowly gathered around him, their faces pale with anticipation. Poirot stood up from his crouch and held out his hand, which now held a small, delicate object. It was a tiny vial, no larger than a thimble, and it was clear, empty, but unmistakable. A vial that had once contained poison. The gasps from the others were immediate. As the truth slowly sank in, Leela Bennett had not killed Duval with a simple dose of poison. Someone else had been involved. Someone who had known exactly how to manipulate the situation. Someone who had carefully orchestrated Duval's death in a way that would look like an accident. Poirot's voice rang out, cutting through the growing panic. It was not Leela who killed Duval, but someone who knew exactly what would happen when the poison was administered. Someone who knew the exact moment to act. The poison was placed here, beneath the lip of the piano, and it was administered at the precise moment Duval played the last note. He turned to the group, his eyes flashing. Someone knew that Duval's final performance would be the moment when his life would be cut short. Someone who had access to his personal effects. Someone who had been manipulating him all along. Poirot paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. He turned to Dr. Fowler, his gaze piercing. "You were the one, Doctor. You were the one who had access to the vials, the drugs. You knew how to make Duval's death look like an accident, and you used Leela as a pawn in your plan. You knew she would be the one to carry out the final act." Dr. Fowler stood frozen, his face turning pale. His lips parted, but no words came out. It was clear to everyone now that Poirot had unraveled the final mystery. The doctor, having been so calm throughout the investigation, had been the true mastermind behind Duval's death. "Dr. Fowler," Poirot said softly, "you were the one who killed Raymond Duval. And now, you must face the consequences of your actions." The room was silent, the final pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Poirot had uncovered the hidden truth, and justice would soon follow. The room was silent, save for the muffled sound of Poirot's measured breathing. The vial, still held carefully in his hands, glinted in the dim light of Mortimer House's drawing room. It was as if time itself had come to a halt, and all eyes were fixed on the tiny object, the silent witness to a crime carefully orchestrated. Poirot stood poised, his expression calm, but his mind working at a furious pace. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, and yet there was no triumph in his gaze, only the quiet satisfaction of having solved the case. The truth had come into sharp focus, and now it was time to reveal it for all to see. The guests, once so full of apprehension and uncertainty, now sat at the edge of their seats, their hearts pounding in their chests, awaiting Poirot's final deductions. Poirot's eyes moved from the vial in his hand to Dr. Sebastian Fowler, who had grown increasingly pale as the gravity of the situation settled upon him. Fowler, who had been so confident in his ability to deceive, now stood exposed, his facade crumbling in the face of Poirot's unrelenting scrutiny. "You see, Dr. Fowler," Poirot began, his voice firm and measured, "the murder of Raymond Duval was not an accident. It was not a spontaneous act of passion or a crime of opportunity. It was, as I have suspected all along, a carefully constructed plan. A plan in which you played the central role." Fowler opened his mouth, but no words came. His eyes flickered from Poirot to the vial and back again, the reality of his involvement sinking in. Poirot didn't give him the chance to respond. Instead, he continued, his voice cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. "You had access to Duval's personal items, his medicine, his substances. You were a trusted friend and confidant. But beneath your professional demeanor, Dr. Fowler lay a man who had more than just concern for Duval's well-being. You had other motives, motives that were more selfish and far darker than any of us had realized." Poirot's gaze locked on the doctor's, his words deliberate, calculated. "You knew that Duval was in a vulnerable state, drowning in his own self-destructive behavior. You knew that he was on the brink of losing everything, his career, his wealth, his status, and you knew that his life could be controlled. So, you played him, you manipulated him, you encouraged him to keep playing, to keep performing, knowing full well that his health was deteriorating." The guests exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. But Poirot was not finished. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and it was time to reveal the full truth. "You allowed him to continue playing because you saw it as a way to control him," Poirot continued, his eyes never leaving Dr. Fowler. "You knew Duval's fragile health would eventually lead to his collapse, and you used that knowledge to your advantage. But when you saw Leila Bennett, a young woman desperate to secure her own future, you saw an opportunity." Dr. Fowler's face was a mask of silent fury, but Poirot had already turned his attention to the details. "You gave her the means to administer the poison to incapacitate Duval. You knew she would carry out the plan without thinking twice, but you miscalculated, didn't you, Doctor?" Fowler's lips trembled, and finally, he spoke. His voice was hoarse, raw. "You don't understand," he said, his eyes wild. "I didn't want him dead. I never wanted him dead. I only wanted to end his career before he ruined himself further. I thought it would be the only way to stop him, to make him stop playing. He was losing everything. His mind, his health, his future. I couldn't let him destroy himself any longer." Poirot regarded him with an unreadable expression, his gaze piercing. "And yet, Dr. Fowler, your plan failed. What you did not foresee was that Leila Bennett would misinterpret your actions. She, too, was consumed by fear. She was afraid of Duval's power, of his ability to destroy her career and her reputation. So, when she administered the poison, she did not stop. She went too far, just as you did." Poirot stepped back and allowed the weight of his words to settle in the room. The truth, once carefully veiled, had now been brought to light. The players in this tragedy were all complicit in their own ways. Leila Bennett had acted out of fear, Dr. Fowler out of misguided protection, and Duval, the man at the center of it all, had been a victim of both his own choices and the people around him. The tension in the room was palpable, but Poirot was not finished. There was one more piece to address, the letter from Eloise, the false lead that had caused so much confusion. "And what of the letter?" Poirot asked, his voice soft but firm. "The letter you planted, Dr. Fowler, the one that led us down. The path of deception, the letter from Eloise, a woman who, it turns out, was not the key to this puzzle after all. No, the letter was nothing more than a distraction, a way to throw us off your scent." Fowler's face twisted in frustration, but he did not deny it. Poirot smiled thinly. "You used Eloise's name because you knew it would cast suspicion on Leela. You knew that her connection to Duval could be exploited. But the truth was far simpler, far more tragic. It wasn't love that led to Duval's death, nor betrayal. It was fear, fear of losing control." Poirot's gaze shifted to the rest of the room, his eyes lingering on each of the guests in turn. "You all played a part in this tragedy, whether by action or inaction. You watched as Raymond Duval spiraled downward, and each of you turned a blind eye. But it was Dr. Fowler who held the power. It was he who knew how to manipulate the situation to his advantage." Poirot paused, letting his words sink in. The weight of the truth had come crashing down on all of them. The guests sat motionless, their eyes averted, their faces pale with the realization that their roles in Duval's death were far more complicated than they had imagined. "Dr. Fowler," Poirot said finally, his voice firm and unwavering, "you may not have intended for Duval to die, but your actions led to his death. You thought you could control the situation, but you underestimated the human emotions that drive us all. Fear, jealousy, ambition, they are not as easily manipulated as you believed." The room was still as Poirot turned to face Leela Bennet once more. "And you, Mademoiselle Bennet, you acted out of fear, but you are not the murderer. You are a pawn in a much larger game. You allowed yourself to be manipulated by Dr. Fowler, just as Duval was manipulated by his own fears." Leela's eyes filled with tears as she nodded silently. She had confessed, but Poirot knew she had not been the true architect of the tragedy. She had simply been a product of the complex forces at play, a victim of her own circumstances. Poirot addressed the group one last time, his voice soft but resolute. "The truth has been laid bare. Duval's death was not a simple murder. It was a tragic result of many actions, many failures, and now, Dr. Fowler, you must face the consequences of your role in it. You were the one who played the most dangerous game, and now you will pay the price for it." Dr. Fowler, defeated and broken, stood silent as Poirot's words rang in the air. The game was over, and the truth had been revealed. Justice would follow. But for those who had been involved, it would come with the heavy burden of guilt. The case was closed, and the mystery of the pianist who played for the dead had been solved. The tension in the room had dissipated, but in its place was something far more heavy. A silence that felt like the calm after a great storm. Only this storm was the unraveling of a life, of many lives. The truth, as Poirot had meticulously laid it out, had left its indelible mark on each guest, on each person in that room. They all knew that no amount of denial could erase the gravity of what had transpired. The true culprit had been revealed, but the consequences for each were yet to unfold. Poirot stood with a composed, almost serene expression, his sharp mind still working even as the last pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. There was no satisfaction in his gaze, no feeling of triumph, only the quiet reflection of a case well solved. But while the intellectual challenge was over, the emotional toll of what had transpired could not be denied. The group remained seated, though some had shifted uncomfortably. Leela Bennett, still overcome with emotion, was now the center of the room's collective attention. Her confession had shocked everyone, but what lingered was not just her fear or guilt. It was the weight of what had been done, what they all had allowed to happen. Poirot's gaze softened as he turned to her. Mademoiselle Bennet, you acted out of fear, as we all know. You have confessed, and that confession, while not absolving you, is a crucial part of facing the consequences of your actions. His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of deep understanding. You did not mean to kill Duval. You were a pawn in a much larger game, manipulated by Dr. Fowler. Yes, but you still made the choice to act. You must live with that. Leela nodded silently, her tear-filled eyes downcast. She had already admitted her guilt, but there was little comfort in it. She had caused Duval's death. Yes, albeit unintentionally, but the burden of that truth was far heavier than any legal judgment could carry. Her life, her future, was now irrevocably changed. Poirot turned next to Dr. Fowler. Dr. Fowler, it was you who masterminded this tragedy. It was you who took advantage of Duval's vulnerabilities, manipulated Leela, and engineered the death of a man who once trusted you. But you failed to understand that you could not control everything. You failed to account for human emotions, fear, jealousy, ambition, and in the end, you underestimated the people you sought to manipulate. Fowler was visibly shaking now, his once stoic expression broken. He looked up at Poirot with a mixture of anger and remorse. I didn't want this, he said hoarsely, his voice cracking. I never meant for Duval to die. I only wanted to stop him from ruining himself. I thought if I could just make him stop, make him realize what he was doing, he would turn around. I was trying to help him. Poirot's expression remained unchanged, but his voice grew firmer. Help him? You destroyed him, Dr. Fowler. You did not see the man you once claimed to care for. You saw a means to an end, a tool to serve your own purposes. And when you realized that your plan was spiraling out of control, you chose to let it unfold, rather than intervening and stopping the harm you were causing. You are not the victim here, Doctor. You are the perpetrator. Fowler bowed his head in defeat. His shoulders slumped. It was clear to all present that the doctor was unraveling. And though he had not intended for his actions to lead to murder, the damage had been done. He had been blinded by his own sense of control. And now he was forced to confront the reality of the consequences. Poirot stepped back slightly, his gaze sweeping over the room once more. The other guests, once so vocal and adamant in their own perspectives, now sat in stunned silence. There was little they could say. For Poirot had laid bare the intricate web of manipulation, guilt, and fear that had entangled them all. They had each played a part, some more consciously than others, in the tragedy that had befallen Raymond Duval. But now, as Poirot had revealed, it was time for each of them to accept their share of responsibility. Turning to face the others, Poirot addressed them in a measured tone. You have all had your roles to play in this drama. Mademoiselle Duval, you allowed your husband's descent into self-destruct to continue unchecked. You, too, must reckon with your own silence, with the failure to stand against his decline. Mr. Mason, your patronage of Duval was based on his talent, but you failed to recognize his humanity, his flaws. You enabled him in ways that now, I am sure, you regret. And Dr. Fowler, the one person who had the power to intervene, chose not to. Lady Mortimer and the other shifted uncomfortably as Poirot's gaze moved between them. But no one spoke up. The truth was now evident to them all, and no amount of protestation could change the facts Poirot had so thoroughly laid out. And yet, you are not all criminals, Poirot continued, his tone softening slightly. There is more to this than just guilt and blame. You have all contributed, yes, but you have also learned something about yourselves, something that cannot be ignored. Leila Bennet, though guilty of administering the poison, was a victim of circumstance, a pawn in a much larger game. And Madeleine Duval, though complicit in her silence, was not an active participant in her husband's death. Mr. Mason, you allowed your patronage to blind you to the reality of the situation. But none of you are beyond redemption. If you are willing to face your role in what happened. The room remained silent, but the shift in the atmosphere was palpable. Poirot had delivered his judgment, and though the consequences for each individual remained to be determined, the emotional weight of his words had left a lasting impact. Poirot turned toward the door, his voice once again commanding the room's attention. I will leave you with this final thought. Justice is not always swift, and it is not always clear, but it is inevitable. The truth has a way of making itself known, no matter how much we try to bury it. And though Duval is gone, the consequences of his death will continue to reverberate through each of your lives. He paused, his eyes lingering on each guest. I do not offer forgiveness, for that is not mine to give, but I offer you the chance to make things right, to reflect on your own actions, and to seek redemption, if that is possible. The law will do its work, but it is your conscience that must carry the heaviest burden. With those final words, Poirot turned and walked toward the door. He had solved the case. The murderer had been revealed. But in this case, the true punishment was not just a matter of law. It was a matter of the soul. As Poirot departed Mortimer House, the guests were left. In the wake of his words, the house, once filled with intrigue and secrets, now felt like a tomb of remorse. And for the first time, those within it began to understand the true weight of what had transpired. The soft ticking of the clock echoed through the drawing room, but the air in Mortimer House was thick with unspoken tension. Poirot had left his guests to their reflections, allowing them the time to confront the reality of what had transpired. Now, as the final chapters of the case were drawn to a close, Poirot himself had retreated to a quiet corner of the estate, sitting at a table with a glass of water, reviewing the details of his case one last time. In the stillness of the room, his mind turned over the facts once more. There were no loose ends, no ambiguities. The mystery of Raymond Duval's death had been solved. Yet, despite the intellectual satisfaction that Poirot always found in bringing the truth to light, there was no celebration in this case. Duval's death, though tragic, had been part of a much larger web of human emotions: fear, ambition, jealousy, and desperation. These emotions, rather than any one individual's action, had driven the pianist to his untimely end. Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching from the hallway. He turned slightly, recognizing the familiar presence of Inspector Geoffrey, the local law enforcement officer who had been part of the investigation since the beginning. Geoffrey stepped into the room, his face wary but resolute. "I trust you have the full picture now, Poirot." Geoffrey's voice was tinged with exhaustion, but there was a note of respect in it. Poirot nodded, his fingers tapping lightly on the table as he reflected on the events that had led them to this point. "Yes, my friend, the picture is complete. The pieces are all in place, and the truth is clear." Geoffrey lowered himself into a chair across from Poirot, folding his hands together. "Then the question is, what happens next? We know who did it, but the law must now follow its course. What do you suggest?" Poirot paused for a moment, his gaze steady. He did not answer immediately, instead choosing to focus on the weight of the question. What did justice mean in this case? Was it simply about arresting the culprit and moving on, or was it something deeper, a reflection of the human condition, the tangled web of relationships that could lead to such a tragic end? Justice, my friend, is rarely as simple as the law would suggest, Poirot finally replied, his voice soft but firm. "I have solved the case. The guilty party has confessed, and the evidence is irrefutable. But what is justice? It is not simply a matter of punishment. It is about understanding, about seeing the truth for what it is, and recognizing the role each person played in the tragedy." Geoffrey regarded Poirot with a mixture of admiration and confusion. "But you know, the law, Poirot, the law is clear. Dr. Fowler is guilty of orchestrating Duval's death. He manipulated Leela Bennett and pushed the pianist to the brink. He should be held accountable for his actions, and the law will take its course. Surely that's the right thing to do." Poirot leaned back in his chair, considering the words carefully. "Indeed, Geoffrey, the law will take its course. But what of the others involved? The ones who allowed Duval to spiral into this madness? Should they not also face some consequence? Shouldn't they be made to reckon with their own complicity?" The inspector shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze drifting toward the window, where the soft rays of the setting sun filtered through the drawn curtains. "I don't know, Poirot. We're talking about a man's life here, a murder. I understand what you're saying, but the law is not concerned with remorse or guilt. It's concerned with justice, with what can be proven." Poirot smiled, faintly, his eyes gleaming with quiet wisdom. "Ah, Geoffrey, My friend, the law is concerned with what can be proven. Yes, but justice is something more. It is something that resides in the heart. It is about understanding the motivations behind a crime, recognizing the forces that drive a person to commit such an act. And only then can true justice be served. There was a long pause as Geoffrey digested Poirot's words. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter now. So what do you think should happen next? How should we proceed? Poirot's gaze turned toward the door, as if he could already see the resolution unfolding. The law must take its course, as you rightly say. Dr. Fowler will be arrested for his role in Duval's death. He will be tried, and he will face the consequences of his actions. But the others, they too must reckon with their own guilt. They will not escape the truth simply because the law cannot reach them. Their own consciences will be their judge. Geoffrey sat back in his chair, rubbing his temples as he processed the weight of Poirot's words. So you're saying they'll live with the guilt of their involvement, even if they aren't punished by the law? Poirot nodded, his face unreadable. Exactly. True justice is not about the law alone. It is about moral reckoning, about the realization that we are all responsible for our actions, whether or not we are caught. And that is the greatest punishment of all. The inspector remained silent for a moment, then sighed, his shoulders sagging. I see. I suppose I hadn't considered it that way. But you're right. The law may give them a sentence, but their own guilt, that will never leave them. Poirot's eyes softened as he regarded Geoffrey. Indeed. And so, we come to the final chapter of this story. The guests at Mortimer House will face their own consequences, and Dr. Fowler will face the law. But let us not forget that justice is not always clear-cut. It is not always about who is arrested or who is punished. It is about understanding the full complexity of the human condition. Geoffrey nodded slowly, his face thoughtful. And what about Leela Bennett? What do we do with her? Poirot's gaze turned to the window once more, watching as the evening light faded into darkness. Mademoiselle Bennett acted out of fear, and though she is guilty, her actions were not premeditated. She will face the consequences of her involvement. But I believe she will be given a chance to redeem herself. The law will decide her fate. But in my eyes, she is not the true villain of this story. She was a victim of her circumstances, manipulated by those who should have known better. There was a finality in Poirot's tone that made Geoffrey nod in agreement. The case had come to a close, but the ramifications of what had transpired would continue to echo through the lives of everyone involved. Some would face legal consequences, while others would have to live with the weight of their own moral failings. Poirot stood up from his chair, his expression serene as ever. Now, my friend, I believe we must speak with the authorities. The legal proceedings will begin, and Dr. Fowler will be held accountable. But as for the others, it is up to them to decide how they will carry the burden of what they have done. As Poirot made his way to the door, Geoffrey stood up as well, his eyes lingering on the detective. You've done it again, Poirot. Solved the case, uncovered the truth. I don't know how you do it. Poirot smiled, his usual modesty in place. It is not just about solving the case, Geoffrey. It is about understanding the people involved, understanding their motivations, their fears. That is where the true answer lies. The truth is always there, hidden beneath the surface. We must simply be patient enough to uncover it. With that, Poirot opened the door and stepped into the hallway, Geoffrey following behind him. As they made their way toward the waiting authorities, the detective's words echoed in the air. The case of Raymond Duval's death had been solved, and justice was on its way. But for those involved, the path to redemption was far more complex. It was a journey that would require more than just legal punishment. It would require a deep and honest reckoning with their own actions. The days following the conclusion of the investigation at Mortimer House were filled with the inevitable processes of law and consequence. Dr. Fowler had been arrested, and the authorities began their work in earnest, setting the wheels of legal justice into motion. But for those who had been involved, the real weight of the case was not found in the courtroom, nor in the judgment of the law. It lay in the quiet spaces, between moments of reflection, in the private reckoning of each individual's conscience. The puzzle had been solved, and the pieces fit perfectly, but now it was time to live with the consequences. For Hercule Poirot, the mystery had been as much about the people as it had been about the crime itself. The intricate web of relationships, fears, and motivations that had ultimately led to Raymond Duval's death had unfolded like a tragic play, and Poirot had been the observer and, at times, the conductor. But now, standing in the comfort of his modest apartment overlooking the River Thames, Poirot was alone, reflecting not on the case itself, but on the lessons it had imparted. The ticking of a nearby clock was the only sound that filled the quiet room as Poirot sat at his desk, a cup of tea cooling beside him. His mind was sharp as ever, but this time his thoughts turned inward, contemplating not just the intricate details of the case, but the deeper implications of human nature. The investigation had been a success in the traditional sense. The murderer was found, the crime was solved, and the truth was exposed. But what was the truth, really? What did it mean to uncover a crime if the true nature of those involved was left unexamined? Poirot sipped his tea, his gaze drifting out the window. The world outside seemed peaceful, as though untouched by the storm of emotions and tragedies that had unfolded within Mortimer House. He wondered if any of the people involved in the case were finding the peace they so desperately needed. Were they reflecting on their actions? Were they learning anything from the consequences of their involvement? Or were they simply waiting for the storm to pass, to be forgotten by the world? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of a knock at the door. Poirot set down his cup and rose from his chair, making his way toward the entrance. He opened the door to reveal Inspector Geoffrey, his face still weary, but with a hint of resolve. He had clearly come to offer a final report, or perhaps to seek some closure himself. Ah, mon ami, Inspector Geoffrey, Poirot said with his customary smile. Please, come in. I trust you are well. Geoffrey stepped inside, his usual stiffness now tempered by the weight of the case. He nodded, but did not immediately speak. Poirot gestured to the chairs by the window, and Geoffrey took a seat, his eyes scanning the room briefly before settling on the detective. I thought I'd give you one last report on the case, Poirot. Geoffrey began, his voice steady, but carrying the burden of the investigation's aftermath. We've processed everything, and Dr. Fowler's trial is set to begin in a few weeks. He'll be facing charges of manslaughter, and the evidence is stacked against him. Leela Bennett. Well, she's been taken into custody, but she'll likely receive a much lighter sentence, given her role in all this. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, taking a seat across from Geoffrey and the others. He asked, Madeleine Duval, Mason, and the others who played their parts in the tragedy. Geoffrey sighed, rubbing his temples. It's complicated. Madeleine Duval will not face criminal charges, though she may face some civil action regarding her failure to intervene. As for Mason, he's been implicated in enabling Duval's behavior, but there's little we can do there. His influence and wealth have shielded him from facing real consequences. In truth, it's mostly a matter of public opinion and personal guilt now. Poirot's expression softened. And what of their conscience? Mon ami. What of their own moral reckoning? Geoffrey paused, clearly uncertain. You know as well as I do. Poirot, the law deals in facts, in evidence. Conscience, that's something else entirely. The guilty will live with their own decisions, their own sense of responsibility. But the law doesn't always punish them for that. Some will carry the burden of their guilt for the rest of their lives. But others, I imagine, will simply move on. Poirot nodded slowly. Yes, that is the tragedy of it all. Justice, as the law defines it, will be served, but true justice is much more elusive. It lies not in a courtroom, but in the hearts and minds of those who must face the truth of their actions. Geoffrey was silent for a moment, clearly grappling with the weight of Poirot's words. Finally, he spoke again. You know, Poirot, I've been thinking about what you said, about how everyone involved in this tragedy played a part, even if they didn't commit the actual crime. I think you're right. No one can truly escape their role in it all. And that's the hardest part of the case. Poirot's eyes met Geoffrey's, and for a moment, the detective saw a flicker of understanding in the inspector's gaze. Yes, my friend, Poirot said quietly. That is the true punishment. Not the sentence imposed by the law, but the lifelong reckoning with what we have done, the moments we wish we could take back, the chances we failed to seize, the wrongs we allowed to happen. That is the burden that we all must bear. Geoffrey sat back, his face reflecting the somber reality of Poirot's insight. You make it sound so final, Poirot, as if there's no way to move forward. Poirot smiled, but it was not a smile of comfort. There is always a way forward, Geoffrey, but it requires understanding, facing the truth, and accepting it. Some people will move forward with their guilt, while others will choose to bury it. But they will never escape it, no matter how far they run. The inspector nodded slowly. So, what's next for you, Poirot? Will you stay in London? Continue your investigations? Poirot looked out the window again, his gaze distant. I will continue my work, as always, but I do not search for the same things that others do. For me, it is not enough to uncover the crime. It is not enough to solve the puzzle. I seek to understand why people do what they do, why they act as they do. The truth, Joffrey, is far more complex than we often give it credit for. Joffrey stood, seemingly ready to leave, but before he did, he turned to Poirot once more. You know, I've always admired your ability to see beyond the surface, Poirot, to find the truth hidden beneath the lies. I just hope that someday everyone involved in this case will be able to see the truth of themselves. Poirot smiled, faintly, standing to shake the inspector's hand. I hope so too, Mon ami. But sometimes, the truth is not something we find. It is something we must come to terms with. And that, I believe, is the hardest part of all. As Joffrey left, Poirot returned to his desk, staring at the glass of tea now sitting untouched before him. The case was over. The mystery had been solved, and the justice of the law would follow. But Poirot knew that for those involved, true, peace would be a long time coming, for even when the legal consequences were met, the emotional aftermath would linger. The guilt, the remorse, the lessons learned, or perhaps never fully learned, would haunt them far longer than any prison sentence. Poirot turned back toward the window, his thoughts once more drifting. He had solved the case, but this was a case about more than just a crime. It was a case about human nature, about the choices we make, and the ways we deceive ourselves. In the end, that was the true puzzle of the human heart. And for Hercule Poirot, it was a puzzle he would continue to solve, piece by piece, for as long as he lived. The truth, he knew, would always find its way to the surface, and when it did, it would be the final judge of all. The final days of the case at Mortimer House had come to pass, and the truth was now set firmly in the cold light of justice. Dr. Fowler, the mastermind of the tragic death of Raymond Duval, was held accountable. He had confessed, and the law would do its work. But that was not the end of the matter. The moral complexities of the case were far from simple. And though the legal process would provide its resolution, Poirot knew the emotional and psychological consequences would continue for the participants. On the final day, Poirot found himself once again at his desk, methodically reviewing the case in his mind. The events had unfolded as he had suspected, but the human element, the fear, the manipulation, and the desperation had been more complex than he could have predicted. It was these emotions that ultimately led to Duval's demise. They were the hidden forces that had driven Leela, Dr. Fowler, and even the seemingly indifferent guests to play their roles in the tragic performance. Poirot had always known that a crime was never simply a matter of actions and evidence. It was a window into the souls of those involved, a reflection of their motivations, their guilt, and their deepest fears. And in this case, the truth had been buried beneath layers of deception and manipulation. But Poirot had found the key, not in the obvious clues, but in the underlying currents of human nature. As the morning light filtered through the windows of his apartment, Poirot sat back in his chair, satisfied that the puzzle had been solved. The threads were all connected, the mystery unraveled, but there was no joy in it. For while the intellectual challenge had been fulfilled, the real tragedy was the life lost. Raymond Duval, A man whose genius had been squandered by his own flaws, had died because of the actions of those who should have cared for him. And while justice would be served, Poirot knew that it was not always enough to make up for the irreparable. Han dun dot, the doorbell rang, breaking the stillness of the room. Poirot rose and answered, expecting it to be Inspector Joffrey once more. He had been by Poirot's side throughout the investigation, and the two had forged a bond of mutual respect. Sure enough, Joffrey stood in the doorway, his face a mix of resignation and relief. Poirot, Joffrey said quietly, stepping inside. I wanted to personally inform you that Dr. Fowler has been officially charged, and Leela Bennett will be facing a reduced sentence. We've got the conviction we need, but I know you've been thinking about this for more than just the law. You've been looking deeper. Poirot smiled faintly, his eyes thoughtful. Yes, Mon ami, the law may bring justice, but it is the human heart that must reckon with itself. And some hearts will take longer than others to find peace. Joffrey nodded solemnly, pulling up a chair. So, what now, Poirot? What becomes of those who were involved in this case? Poirot paused, his gaze turning to the window as he reflected. Some will carry the weight of their actions for the rest of their lives. Some will find ways to move on, to bury the past beneath the surface. But the truth, as I've said before, does not fade. It remains in the mind, in the heart, in the quiet moments when one is forced to confront what they've done. The inspector sat back, absorbing the weight of Poirot's words. You know, Joffrey said, his voice softer now, you always make it seem so simple. Poirot, you find the truth, expose it, and then everything falls into place. But I'm starting to understand that there's much more to it than just the facts. You've shown me that. Poirot gave a small smile, his expression gentle but firm. The truth, my friend, is never simple. It is hidden beneath layers of fear, pride, and shame. And while the law can punish the guilty, it cannot force them to reconcile with the truth. That is a journey they must take on their own. Joffrey looked at him, his eyes filled with newfound understanding. So, in the end, it's not just about solving the case. It's about revealing the truth so that those involved can live with it. Or fail too. Exactly, Poirot replied, his voice resolute. The case is solved, but the real work begins now. The consequences will continue long after the final verdict is passed. Some will face their guilt, others will try to hide from it, but none of them will ever truly escape it. The truth, once uncovered, never truly lets go. There was a long pause, and for a moment, neither man spoke. Outside, the city bustled with life, unaware of the drama that had unfolded within the walls of Mortimer House. But for those involved, their lives would never be the same. The specter of Raymond Duval's death would linger in their thoughts, their decisions, their relationships, a constant reminder of the complexities of human nature and the consequences of their choices. Poirot stood and walked to his desk, his eyes scanning the papers before him. You may leave now, Joffrey. I have done all that is required of me. The law will take care of the rest, and I believe that the guilty parties will face their reckoning. But, as always, The true test of character lies in what happens after the case is closed. Geoffrey stood, extending a hand to Poirot. "Thank you, Poirot, for everything." Poirot shook the inspector's hand firmly, his expression softening. "It is my duty, mon ami, but more than that, it is my privilege. The truth is a powerful thing. It has the power to heal, to redeem, but also to wound, to tear apart. The challenge, always, is knowing which path to choose when faced with it." With that, Geoffrey turned and left the apartment, leaving Poirot alone with his thoughts. As he stood there, contemplating the case that had been and gone, Poirot realized that this particular mystery had been more than just a puzzle to solve. It had been a lesson, one that would linger in his mind for years to come. Raymond Duval's death had been the result of choices made, choices of manipulation, fear, and control. But it had also been the result of those who failed to act when it mattered, those who allowed their own emotional turmoil and pride to cloud their judgment. In the end, Poirot had not only uncovered a murderer, but he had uncovered the deep flaws and vulnerabilities of those involved. As Poirot returned to his desk, he paused for a moment, reflecting on the case's final lesson. He had solved the mystery, but the true resolution wasn't how those involved would choose to move forward. The truth had been revealed, but it was up to them to find their own peace, or not. And with that, Poirot allowed himself a small, contented smile. His work was done. The case was closed. But the moral of the story, the understanding of human nature, would always remain with him. That was the true mystery, and the true reward. In this final section, the case of Raymond Duval's death comes to a close, and Poirot reflects on the deeper lessons that the case has imparted. While justice is served in the form of legal consequences for Dr. Fowler and Leela Bennett, Poirot reminds the inspector that true resolution comes from facing the truth within oneself. The story ends with Poirot's recognition that the moral and emotional aspects of the case will linger with those involved. Long after the legal matters are settled, the truth has been uncovered. But the journey to live with it and to find peace is the true challenge.